Hi, my name's Matthew Bogart.
This is where I talk. I have too many things going on in my head I'm trying to keep track of. Sorry. You want to do it again?
It's okay. Hi, my name's Matthew Bogart,
And I'm Jesse Holden.
and we're the co creators of a graphic novel series called Incredible Doom. It's the story about a group of teenagers in the early 90s who get their lives just turned upside down by the early internet. Eleanor Davis, the author of The Hard Tomorrow and How to Be Happy, called it a rush of love for brave beginnings of both the early internet and the teens who used it to find themselves and each other. This is a video series about the creation of the comic and some of the stories that went into inspiring it. In the last episode, we talked about how the project got started. In this episode, we thought we'd talk a little bit about how we work together. The first big decision that I remember us talking about was who was going to be in charge, who was going to make the final decisions about things. And I think we settled on pretty quickly the idea that this was going to be essentially my comic, that I was going to make the final decision if there was something that we weren't agreeing on, that I owned the copyright, that I got to make the final decision on finances and on production and on story and on art.
If anyone were to listen to this for advice, I would say just it almost doesn't matter who it is. It matters that you have that established. Otherwise, you are putting yourself in a collaborative kind of tug of war that's just going to constantly be resurfacing.
Talking about it up front is incredibly crucial, especially when it came to the contract that we put together before we started working. The same time we were working out the creative relationship, we sat down and had long conversations about legal stuff. I was inspired by a talk that my friend Katie Lane did, and it really opened my eyes to the importance of trying to go through every possible scenario with your collaborator before serious work really gets underway. So Jesse and we sat down and talked about, all right, what happens to the project if Jesse decides he can't be involved anymore? Is Matt allowed to continue without him? And vice versa, what happens to the project if Matt can't continue anymore? Under what circumstances does one person get paid money, considering that we might be starting off making $30 a month? What happens to the project if one of us dies? We went through all of that and just wrote up a document ourselves without a lawyer involved, just to try to get the gist of how we imagined this partnership going down on paper.
When you're talking about these things, you have to talk about scenarios where the other person is trying to screw you over.
Right.
Any number of things can happen that are outside of your control. Then you could end up in a situation that's adversarial, and you don't want to write a contract presuming that you're never going to be in an adversarial position. Yeah. So a kind of a thought experiment I would get into is I would say, well, Matt, I know you would never do this to me because I'm incredibly close to you and I love you, but Dark Matt, your parallel universe, Matt, could, if he really wanted to leverage this part of the contract against me, you can see how that would be really bad. And that's not our intention in how we write this contract. So if Dark Matt does that, what out do I have?
Right, exactly.
If Dark Jesse shows up and says well, you know what? This part of the story is based on my life and you can't copyright my life. So, if Dark Jesse did that, what would this contract say to protect Matt from that?
When we were just starting and talking about drawing little tiny mini comics that their interiors were printed at the local copy shop, it seemed ridiculous to be talking about, well, what happens to the television rights?
Right.
But there's so many things that we went through at that time that turned out not to be ridiculous. It sounds over the top. And if the project had gone nowhere, it would have been just a couple wasted days. But when the project actually started to go somewhere, it was incredibly useful, and I highly recommend it. So the way we got started writing what became the first volume of Incredible Doom was we spent a couple months meeting weekly and roughing out just some bare bone plot elements that we thought we'd like to explore throughout the series. After we had that outline, we'd just go one issue at a time, digging into what needed to happen in that book and in what ways it could happen. I'd write out an outline that was just 12 or 15 different points. It would say like flashback scene, Allison gets locked in trunk by dad. New computer comes home. Allison learns new computer. Allison discovers the early internet. And I'd take that out, an outline that goes all the way from the beginning of the issue to the end, and I'd sit down by myself and write a script in screenplay format. I'd write that from beginning to end, and then I'd send it to Jesse to read, and he'd give me notes.
It can be very small things, like sometimes I think a line will land better if you just take one word out, or I think we need an entire scene here to establish what's about to happen in that sense. But then, like, maybe a good example of a collaborative moment would be there's a moment when they're sitting out behind the house, and an important thing happens, which is that Allison opens up to Samir to talk about a horrible thing that Dad did, which was took a crowbar to her windshield of her car because he was upset. I said, here's how that this dynamic could play. It may be important that she doesn't appreciate how bad that is. She needs somebody outside of her to kind of give her perspective and to say, like, that's not something a dad does. That's not something that you should just like shrug off in the way that you seem to be shrugging it off. Like, from where I'm sitting, that's really, really bad. That we could kind of make that moment play that way, I think was important, because it feeds a key aspect of the relationship, was that Samir is not just an avenue out of the home environment that Allison is in, but he's kind of a voice of reason and perspective for her. I think that if they hadn't had that moment, she wouldn't have had the courage to go along with the kind of the ultimate escape that they were going along with.
So then the next page in the process is I throw everything out.
Dark Matt comes in and says, what if we just did none of this and did something entirely different? Here, I have all of the work that we've done bundled up in my arms right now. What if I took this over to the dumpster and I just placed it in the dumpster, and then I put the lid down on the dumpster and walked back to you and said, okay, so what are we doing for the story?
We're sort of joking, but this has happened several times. Often when I get through the script writing phase is when I will discover that something isn't working the way I hoped it was.
When a meeting with Matt starts and it's clear this is a let's pull the reset lever meeting, it's a little bit like, okay, Matt's burning down the house, let me grab all the valuables and make sure they make it out of the house. And sometimes it's things I have to let go of, and sometimes it's things that we get to kind of reestablish if they're important, and if so, why they're important.
And then once you learn that, you can build upon that and strengthen those things that it turned out couldn't be torn out. And that it really tells you what the crucial parts of the story are. There's a technique that the writers of Breaking Bad talk about on their podcast, where they would routinely take their characters and throw them into a situation that is so difficult to get out of that the writers themselves didn't have a clue how to get out of it. They would throw Walt and Jesse into a camper van and have cops standing outside the camper van banging on the door saying, let me in. And you'd think, they're caught. What could the writers possibly have in mind that's going to get them out of this van? And the answer was, they didn't have anything in mind. They just put themselves in this situation and then trusted that the group of them, once they'd committed to this, were going to be able to figure something out. A writing process that pretty much guarantees that the audience is never going to be ahead of you. So all of that was the inspiration for this one panel here, where we show Samir, who's about to run away from home without his pants on. Because we wanted to put ourselves as writers into that same position where we had no idea how they were going to get by with no money and no pants.
One of the things we talked about when we were talking about how to construct the little arcs for each issue was we wanted to have each issue have a lock break moment, meaning a moment that something changes that you can't unwind. You know, when she peels the lock off the door, there's no reassembling the lock on the door afterwards. She's committed to a course of action in that moment.
we always tried to end an issue with a particular type of feeling. And that feeling was, we described it as problem solved, we're fucked. Which means, yay, hooray, the protagonist has solved one of their biggest problems. Unfortunately, in solving that problem, everything else just got a lot worse. Another example of a writing technique that we used is during the 3rd chapter of Volume 1, where Allison and Samir are spending the day together for the first time.
This was one that a lot of people singled out as a favorite of theirs. And a lot of that boiled down to kind of the quiet, intimate moments we could find between Samir and Allison. And which is funny, because I was kind of dreading trying to help write those moments because they require such a delicate touch. And then Matt was just like, oh, I'll just knock those out. I'll just do the feeling stuff in the middle. And then he did, and it's like everybody's favorite parts of the thing.
You know what the secret is to being able to write like quiet, intimate moments about couples in a relationship is spending your entire adolescence mostly writing comics about characters that want girlfriends.